Iran had promised harsh revenge, but not given the time frame. In the end, Operation Mata Soleimani, in retaliation for the assassination of its Quds general, came quickly in a salvo of missiles on air bases housing American forces in Iraq. Missiles launched from inside Iran struck two air bases in Erbil and Al-Assad, just west of Baghdad. Iran says 80 American terrorists were killed. But President Trump tweeted that all was well and said casualties and damage were being assessed. He'll make a statement at the White House later. But does this draw a line under hostilities going forward? Our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen is in Baghdad.
Iran had been threatening severe retaliation, and the missiles were fired just after midnight. The Iranians seem to be trying to calibrate their response to satisfy fury at home and not to provoke President Trump into a particularly destructive military retaliation. The Iranian Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif, said in a tweet, that's the battleground for this diplomacy at the moment, that Iran's actions were rooted in international law, in Article 51 of the UN Charter, which deals with a state's right to self-defense. He seemed in that tweet to be trying to draw a line under retaliation. But then quite a different message came from Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. He was speaking in Qom, a holy city in Iran, and he seemed to suggest that the night's attacks were not enough.
Revenge, that's something else. What happened last night was just a slap in the face. That's something else.
The Ayatollah said the corrupting presence of the United States had to be removed from the region. The crowd chanted, "God is greatest," and "Death to America." Even if this is the beginning of the end of the crisis caused by the assassination, the long-term conflict between Iran and the US continues to edge towards war, and that process won't stop without some kind of diplomacy leading to a political deal. There seemed to be one back in 2015 when they signed the Iran nuclear agreement, but President Trump pulled out of that a couple of years ago, and since then this crisis has grown and grown. There remains a really serious danger of war. This remains one of the world's most dangerous and unstable conflicts.
Today we are armed. The nation of Iran is equipped today against the bullies of the world. Last night we slapped the US on the face. When it comes to confrontation, military actions of this kind are not enough. What is important is the corrupt presence of the United States in this region must come to an end. They brought war and hostility and deception and destruction to this region. Wherever they go, this happens. They are still insisting that this corruption, this destructiveness, should be imposed on Iran.
The Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, giving a pretty wide-ranging speech there following those missile attacks on Iraqi targets for the retaliation of the killing of Qasem Soleimani. He talked about the Iranian Revolution back in 1979 being a pivotal change for the country and the world. He said that Iranians should use the historical lessons of the revolution to confront Iran's enemies today. Not surprisingly, he focused, of course, on Qasem Soleimani, and he spoke at length about Soleimani. He said he had great character and personality. He said he was a brave warrior, a person with initiative. He was sincere and not a hypocrite. He said Soleimani was a very religious man and drew on his faith. He said Soleimani always supported the cause of the Palestinians in their struggle against Israel, and he said the presence of the US in the region should and would come to an end.
Newsbreak coming in on the US-Iran standoff, which was intensified. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has spoken to the US bases and on the attacks in Iraq. Iran says, "We slapped them, Americans, on the face last night, but military action is not enough." Meanwhile, China urged the United States and Iran to exercise restraint and resolve their dispute through dialogue after Iran retaliated against US forces.
Their hostility, their animosity towards us is in their nature. If some people think that if we take one step back and if we become a bit moderate, the Americans will stop their animosity. This is wrong. This is completely wrong. Some people say do not do things that will make the Americans angry. But this is against what the God has said himself in the Quran. They're angry, they're nervous because of the successes of us, of ours in science and service and military. They're nervous, they're angry with this, all these advancements that we have had.
We've said very clearly that if the United States takes any further action, Iran will respond accordingly, and we will respond in a very harsh way, but proportionately. Yes. As I told you yesterday, it is up to the United States to now come to its senses and stop its adventurism in this region. Well, we did not start this process of escalation. The United States waged an economic war against Iran. The United States has to come to its senses. The presence of Iranian people in the streets of many cities, unprecedented in the history, a sea of humanity, has to bring the United States to its senses that if it wants to deal with this people, it has to deal with this people based on respect, not based on threat and not based on sanctions.
What is the role of Europe? What is the role of Europe?
Europe can play a useful role by informing the United States of the serious error in their analysis, that they should stop listening to clowns, that they should base their policy based on realities and not some illusions of some clowns who have ambitions elsewhere.
I want to cut across to my colleagues Shiv Arur and Abhishek Bhalla. Shiv, would you get us up to speed with the very latest developments that are filtering in?
Very disturbing developments in the area right now, where the war rhetoric is at an all-time high. You just heard from, the Ayatollah of Iran himself, Preeti, where there is almost a kind of religious anger rhetoric that is building in Iran as far as the United States is concerned. And with the US election actually looming, anything could actually happen. The fact is, on the ground, the Iranian media is reporting that at that base which has been struck, the US base that has been struck in Iraq, 80 servicemen have been killed. That number is nowhere near what the United States is claiming. President Trump, who was supposed to make a statement later tonight, is apparently not going to be making a statement, but will be issuing a written statement about it. So all kinds of theories about what that could actually mean. But tensions extremely high at this point of time.
Jeremy Byrne, our Middle East editor, speaking to us from Baghdad. Well, in the past few hours, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has demanded, as we heard, the United States leave the Middle East. He had this to say about the attack itself.
Revenge, that's something else. What happened last night was just a slap in the face. That's something else.
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Let's speak to our security correspondent Frank Gardner. As Jeremy was saying, Frank, I mean, slightly different messages coming from the Supreme Leader and from Iran's Foreign Minister. What are you reading to that?
Well, really, I think it's symptomatic of the two Irans. There is what I call the front of house, the fairly sort of emollient statements, relatively mild and moderate, coming from people like the Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif, who says, we've concluded this, let's draw a line on this, that's the end of it. But the deep state, the security, intelligence and Revolutionary Guards establishment in Iran, the hardliners, they're not going to let it rest there. What we've seen now is the end of phase one. This is the overt Iranian response. Very much for domestic consumption. There we've hit a slap in the face to America. We've punished them. The domestic narrative is that 80 Americans have been killed. I don't think anything like that is true. We haven't even heard of any casualties. But that isn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks and months, they will continue to harass and harry US forces in the region, not just in Iraq, but in other places as well. And the aim being to drive the US out of the wider Middle East, but particularly out of Iraq and Syria, clearing a way for a swathe of Iranian-dominated territory all the way from the Afghan border to the Mediterranean coast.
What's striking, though, in the immediate aftermath, President Trump's tweet, pretty neutral, really. I mean, things seemed okay. You know, he's going to speak in a few hours' time. It's as if both sides are trying to keep a lid on this. I mean, is that your sense as well? I mean, is there any suggestion that America could have been tipped off about this?
There's no suggestion, but I think it's perfectly possible. I mean, it is extraordinary that 22 ballistic missiles, and these are powerful missiles, accurate as well, could be aimed directly at two bases housing coalition and, you know, US and other forces, and yet there's not a single casualty reported. It's extraordinary. So if you look as well at the attack that took place in Saudi Arabia in September, 25 missiles, cruise and drones, hit precise bits of machinery in the Saudi oil refinery infrastructure that crippled that output, knocked out half the output in just the space of a few minutes. So when the Iranians want to do something, I mean, they denied that, they say it was the Houthis, but most experts say the Houthis weren't capable of doing that. When the Iranians want to do something, they're pretty accurate. They think very carefully about it. And remember that the Quds force that Qasem Soleimani commanded, this is their bread and butter. This is what they do. They are expert at covert operations and military operations, very carefully planned, often deniable, what's called black ops.
What should we read into the fact also that the hardliners of the Revolutionary Guard have admitted being behind this? Because that is new, isn't it? Because normally this has all been played out in some sort of shadowy proxy fight.
I think there is an acceptance in Washington that given the massive impact that the killing of Qasem Soleimani has had on Iran and the huge crowds, the outpouring of not just grief but calls for vengeance that we saw, they had to do something pretty big and overt and say, yes, we've struck back at it. So yes, you're right. It's unusual. It's exceptional for them to do it. I don't think we're going to see, unless there is an American retaliation, I doubt we're going to see another overt Iranian attack. But we will see some mysterious attacks that probably have the hand of Iran behind them, but it's be hard to actually pin it to its door.
Okay, all right. So Frank, for now, thank you very much indeed.
Let's go to Assad Baig, who joins us live now from the Iranian capital. Assad, so a wide-ranging and sobering speech, the Supreme Leader reminding the nation to draw upon the lessons of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in confronting Iran's enemies today. But he also had some very lengthy praise for Qasem Soleimani, killed in that US drone strike.
Yes, that's right. Qasem Soleimani was a friend of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And what's also important is it's not usual for the Supreme Leader's speeches to be carried live, and this one was. He also said that yesterday's missile attack against US forces was a slap in their face, and it was time for them to leave the region. But also backing up everything that he's saying, he's giving a theological reassurance, or the theological foundation to it. He said that having military equipment isn't enough, but he did say that Iran did possess the military equipment that would help them stand up to the bullies, and focusing specifically on the United States. He spoke about how outside forces are trying to influence people. He spoke about the protests that took place here in November and how outsiders are trying to infiltrate those protests, referring to some of them as rioters and some of the damage that was done to buildings here. But this is the first speech after the missile attack against the United States, against the United States forces, and something that the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei had said that would happen. He said that we would avenge Qasem Soleimani, and his imagery was used throughout his speech. You saw people in the audience carrying pictures of Qasem Soleimani, and those pictures are all over Iran currently.
Assad, we understand that the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has also been talking. What's he been saying?
Well, he's also been coming out with some strong words. He said that the United States cut off the hand of Qasem Soleimani, but Iran will cut off their feet and make sure that the US is ousted from the region. Now, this is something that's been echoed from military commanders here, from the people on the streets asking for revenge. But as far as Iran is concerned, this is the end of the matter, as long as the United States does not retaliate. Iran says that they reacted to a specific assassination of the General Qasem Soleimani, so they were responding to the United States. But if the United States retaliates, then Iran will escalate.
As long as I'm President of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over. Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. We will never let that happen. Last week, we took decisive action to stop a ruthless terrorist from threatening American lives. At my direction, the United States military eliminated the world's top terrorist, Qasem Soleimani. As the head of the Quds Force, Soleimani was personally responsible for some of the absolutely worst atrocities. He trained terrorist armies, including Hezbollah, launching terrorist strikes against civilian targets. He fueled bloody civil wars all across the region. He viciously wounded and murdered thousands of U.S. troops, including the planting of roadside bombs that maim and dismember their victims. Soleimani directed the recent attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq that badly wounded 4 service members and killed 1 American, and he orchestrated the violent assault on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. In recent days, he was planning new attacks on American targets, but we stopped him. Soleimani's hands were drenched in both American and Iranian blood. He should have been terminated long ago. By removing Soleimani, we have sent a powerful message to terrorists. If you value your own life, you will not threaten the lives of our people. As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior. In recent months alone, Iran has seized ships in international waters, fired an unprovoked strike on Saudi Arabia, and shot down 2 U.S. drones. Iran's hostilities substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013. and they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion in cash. Instead of saying thank you to the United States, they chanted death to America. In fact, they chanted death to America the day the agreement was signed. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration. The regime also greatly tightened the reins on their own country, even recently killing 1,500 people at the many protests that are taking place all throughout Iran. The very defective JCPOA expires shortly anyway and gives Iran a clear and quick path to nuclear breakout. Iran must abandon its nuclear ambitions and end its support for terrorism. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality. They must now break away from the remnants of the Iran deal, or JCPOA. And we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place. We must also make a deal that allows Iran to thrive and prosper and take advantage of its enormous untapped potential. Iran can be a great country. Peace and stability cannot prevail in the Middle East as long as Iran continues to foment violence, unrest, hatred, and war. The civilized world must send a clear and unified message to the Iranian regime. Your campaign of terror, murder, mayhem will not be tolerated any longer. It will not be allowed to go forward. Today, I am going to ask NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East process. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before, and America has achieved energy independence. These historic accomplishments change our strategic priorities. These are accomplishments that nobody thought were possible. And options in the Middle East became available. We are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration at a cost of $2.5 trillion. U.S. armed forces are stronger than ever before. Our missiles are big, powerful, accurate, lethal, and fast. Under construction are many hypersonic missiles. The fact that we have this great military and equipment, however, does not mean we have to use it. We do not want to use it. American strength, both military and economic, is the best deterrent. 3 months ago, after destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate, we killed the savage leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, who was responsible for so much death, including the mass beheadings of Christians, Muslims, and all who stood in his way. He was a monster. Al-Baghdadi was trying again to rebuild the ISIS caliphate and failed. Tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed or captured during my administration. ISIS is a natural enemy of Iran. The destruction of ISIS is good for Iran, and we should work together on this and other shared priorities. Finally, to the people and leaders of Iran, we want you to have a future, and a great future, one that you deserve, one of prosperity at home and harmony with the nations of the world. The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. I want to thank you, and God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
It's very, very difficult to see what will happen from here, but potentially what we could see is a bigger role for the United Kingdom, for Germany and France into trying to broker some deal. The European Union really needs to tell Trump that that Iran isn't playing games here, that his tactics, Mr. Trump's tactics, are not going to work. And so maybe this is what's going to happen, that the European Union, that the nations apart from the US will have a greater role in this. But Iran is an unpredictable country, to say the least. Anything could happen from here. This is far from a closed book. This story could rumble on, if not for days and weeks, for years ahead.
Indeed, an unpredictable country dealing with, I think it's fair to say, an unpredictable president. Oliver Whitfield-Miotrich, thanks for looking at that story with us.